Hi, I just want to make a quick little disclaimer. I do unfortunately say that a lot of names and a lot of words wrong. Unfortunately, I did my best. Just bear with me. Anyway, without out of the way, I hope you enjoy the video voiceover.
Chapter 1. Will he go alone? Murtagh gave Thor a quizzical look. The red dragon sat crouched next to him atop the rocky hill where they had landed. In the fading dusk, the sparkle of dragon scales was subdued, tamped down like coals in a banked fire, waiting for a breath of wind to flare back to brilliance. What? You go with me? A wolfish grin split Thorn's jaw, showing rows of sharp white teeth, each as long as a dagger. Why not? They already fear us. Let them scream and scurry at our arrival. The dragon's thoughts resonated like a bell in Murtagh's mind. He shook his head as he unbuckled his sword, Xerox from his waist. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Thorn's jaw hung open wider, and his burrowed tongue ran across his chops. Maybe. Murtagh could just picture Thorn stalking down a narrow street, scraping the sides of buildings with his armored shoulders, breaking beams and shutters and conscious, while folks fled before him. Murtagh knew how that would end, with fire and blood, and a flattened circle of destruction. I think you'd best wait here. Thorn shuffled his velvet wings and coughed deep in his throat, his way of laughing. Then perhaps you should use magic to change the colors of my scales, and we could pretend to be Aragon and Sapphire. Wouldn't that be fine, sport? Murtagh snorted as he laid Xerox across a patch of dry grass. He'd been surprised to discover that Thorn had a trenchant sense of humor. It hadn't been readily apparent when they'd been bonded, partly because of Thorn's youth and partly because of the attending circumstances. For a moment, Murtagh's mood darkened. No? Well then, if you change your mind, you'll be the first to know. With the tip of his snout, Thorn nudged the sword. I wish you would take your fang and your claw, you sharpened affliction. Murtagh knew Thorn was nervous. He always was when Murtagh left, even for a short while. Don't worry, I'll be fine. A puff of pale smoke rose from the dragon's flared nostrils. I don't trust that shark's mouth sulker. I don't trust anyone except for you and her. Murtagh flattered as he went on one of the saddlebags that hung along Thorn's side. An image of Nisadius, almond eyes, flashed before him. Cheekbones, teeth, parts and pieces that failed to sum the whole. A memory of her scent accomplished by a yearning and a sorrow and an aching absence for what might have been and now was lost. Yes, he couldn't have led to Thorn even if he wanted to. They were too closely joined for that. The dragon was kind enough to return the conversation to safer ground. Do you think Saros has scented anything of interest? It would be better if he hasn't. Murtagh excavated a ball of brown twine from his saddlebag. But if he has, do we fly towards the storm or away? A thin smile stretched Murtagh's lips. That depends on how violent the storm. It may not be obvious. The wind can lie. He measures the length of twine. Then we'll continue sniffing about until it becomes obvious. As long as we can still change course if need be. One hopes. Thorn's near eye, a deep-set ruby that gleamed with a fierce inner light, remained fixed on Murtagh as he cut the twine and used it to tie Zerkod's crossguard to belt and scabbard so the crimson sword wouldn't slide free. Then he placed Xerox in the saddlebag where it would be safe and hidden and returned to stand before Thorn. I'll be back before dawn. The dragon's hunkered low on his hutches as if braced to take a blow. He kneaded the ground with his curved claw. Like a great cat kneading a blanket, a small rock popped and cracked with explosive force between his talons. A low hum, almost a whine, came from his chest. Murtagh laid a hand on Thorn's jagged forehead and strove to impress a sense of calm and confidence on him. Dark chords of distress echoed in depths of Thorn's mindscape. I'll be fine. If you need me, you'll be there. I know. Thorn bet his neck and his claws grew still from his mind. Murtagh felt a hard, if brittle, resolve. They understand each other. Be careful. Watch for any who might try to sneak up on you. Another bone-vibrating hum emitted from the center of Thorn's chest. And Murtagh pulled the hood of his cloak over his head and started down the side of the hill, picking a path between jagged and solitary stone and clusters of prickly horde bush. He looked back once to see Thorn still crouched upon the crest of the hill, watching with slitted eyes. A man with a dragon was never truly alone, so thought Murtagh as he headed west with a long, loose-limbed stride. No matter how many leagues separated him and Thorn, a part of them would always remain connected, even if the distance kept them from hearing each other's thoughts or feelings, each other's emotions. Magic of the oldest kind joined them. Never would they be quit of it until one of them died. Yet magic was not their only bond. The experience he and Thorn had shared The hardships and mental attacks, the torture had been so intense, so singularly in nature. Murtagh didn't think that anyone else could truly understand what they had endured. There was a certain comfort in the knowledge wherever he went, and whatever he did, Thorn would always be there for him. What's more, Thorn would understand one occasion disproved, perhaps, but even then, the empathy, the compassion, and the same were true in reverse. There was also a sense of confinement to the acknowledgement. Never could they escape one another. Not really, but Murtagh didn't mind. He was well sick of being alone. The land sloped away beneath him until, after several miles, it arrived by the Fae of Fundor. There at the water's edge lay the city of Siano, a rough, whaled collection of buildings darkened with shadows, save for the occasional lamp or candle. Warm gem, set against the encroaching night, rows of fishing boats with furled sails floated alongside the stone wharves, and with them 3 deep-sea vessels with tall masts and broad hulls, ship capable of surviving passage around the northern tip of the peninsula that separated the bay from the open ocean. Across the bay stood the mountains of the spine, swattered and rigid, backed behind a bank of obscuring haze, and the salt water between appeared deep and cold and unfriendly. Gray clouds lay low upon bay and land alike, and a muffled stillness softened the sound of Murtagh's steps. A cold touch on his hands caused him to look up. Thick flakes of snow drifted downward, the first snow of the year. He opened his mouth and caught a flake in his tongue. It melted like a pleasant memory, fleeting and insubstantial. Even this far north, it was unseasonably early for snow. Maddentide had been 2 days past, and that marked the first run of Barragan. The silvery, hard-scaled fish that invaded the bay every autumn. The shoals were so large and dense you could nearly walk on them, and Murtagh had heard that during their height the fish would throw themselves onto the deck on the boats, driven to intense insanity by the intensity of their spawning urges. There was a lesson in that. He felt snow didn't usually arrive until a month or two after Maddentide. For it to be this early meant a bitter, brutal winter was on the way. Still, Murtagh enjoyed the soft falls of snow, and he appreciated the coolness in the air. It was perfect temperature for walking, running, or fighting. Few things were worse than struggling for your life while so hot as to pass out. His pulse quickened, and he tossed back his hood and broke into a quick trot. Feeling the need to move faster, he kept a steady pace as he ran onto the flats surrounding Sion, past creeks and corpses, over stone fences, and through fields of barley and rye ripe for harvest. No one marked his passage save a hound at a farmhouse gate, who gave him a perfunctory howl. And the same to you, Murtagh thought. His connection with Thorn thinned as he ran, but it never vanished, which was a comfort for Murtagh. He felt as nervous as Thorn when they were apart. Although he worked to hide the feeling, not wanting to worsen the dragon's concern, Murtagh would have preferred to land closer to Sion if he needed help. Every second would count. However, the risk of someone spotting Thorn was too great. Best to keep their distance to avoid potential confrontation. With local forces, Murtagh rolled his neck, being on his feet, lungs full of clean, crisp air, pulse pounding at a quick, substantial beat. Felt good after spending most of the day on the dragon's back. His knees and hips ached slightly. He wasn't bow-legged like so many of the cavalry men of Galaboxi's army. But if he continued to spend most of his time on Thorn, it could yet happen. Was that inevitable part of being a dragon rider? A crooked smile lifted his lips. The thought of far-farmed riders, especially the 11 ones walking around with legs as bent as those of a 20-year veteran lancer, was amusing. But he doubted that had been the case. The riders likely had a way to counter the effect of being in the saddle, and at any rate, once a dragon was large enough, it became impossible to sit on like a horse. Shuriken, Galaboxi's mountainous black dragon, had been like that instead of a saddle. Instead of a saddle, the king had installed a small paladin on the hump of Shuriken's enormous shoulders. Murtagh shivered and stopped by a lightning-struck tree. A sudden chill washed his arms and legs. He took a deep breath and another. Galaboxis was dead. Shuriken was dead. They had no hold on him or anyone still living. We're free, he whispered. From Thorn came a sense of comforting warmth, like a distant embrace. He pulled his hood back over his head and continued on. When Murtagh arrived at the coastal road south of Sion, he paused behind a nearby headgeary and poked his head over the top. To his relief, the road was empty. He pushed through the hedge and hurried north towards the wide, slumped bulk of the city. The faint light that penetrated the clouds had nearly vanished, and he waited to be in the Sion before full dark fell. Deep wagon tracks rigid the well-worn road. The paths of cow dung forced him to switch lanes every few steps. The snow was gathering on the ground in a soft, thin layer that reminded him of the decorative lace that ladies would wear to high events at court. He slowed as he approached Sion's outer wall. The fortifications were stout and the well-built, if not so high as those of Tiram or Draslenoa. The blocks of rude-surfaced black stone were mortared without gaps, and the wall had a proper angled batter at the bottom, which he noted with approval. Not that in any of them mattered if you were facing a dragon or a rider. A pair of watchmen leaned on their pikes on either side of Sion's southern gate. Murtagh glanced at the battlements and machets above. No archers were posted on the wall walk, sloppy. The watchman straightened as he neared the Murtaghs, let his cloak fall open to show that he was unarmed. A clink sounded as the watchmen crossed their pipes. "Who goes?" asked the man on the left. He had a face like a rutabaga, with a fat nose cobwebbed with the burst blood vessels, and a yellow bruise under his right eye. Just a Maddentide traveler. And Murtagh, in an easy tone, "Come to purchase smoked bearing head for my master." The man on the right gave him a suspicious once-over. He looked as if he could be the cousin of a fat nose. "Says you, where do you hail from, traveler? And what name might you use?" "Tarok, son of Tirith, and I hail from Illyria." Mention of the capital put some stiffness into the watchmen's backs. They glanced at each other, and then Fat Nose hacked and spat on the ground. The god melted the patch of the snow. "That's an awful long way on foot with no pack and no horse for your bushel of fish. It would be," Murtagh agreed, "but my horse broke her leg last night, stepped in a badger hole, poor thing." "And you left your saddle?" said the right man hand. Murtagh shrugged. "My master pays well, but he's not paying me to lug the saddle and bag halfway across Alagasta, if you follow." The watchman smirked, and Fat Nose said, "Hey, we follow. Have you lodged secured? Coffin for a bed? Coin enough?" Fat Nose nodded. "All right." Fat Nose nodded. "We're not wanting strangers sleeping on our streets. We find you making use of them. We'll see the back side of you. We find you making trouble, out you go. From midnight to the 4th, watch the gates are closed. They'll not open for aunt but the Queen Nasad herself." "That seems reasonable," said Murtagh. Fat Nose grunted, and the watchmen moved their pikes aside. Murtagh gave them a respectful nod and passed between them to enter the city. Murtagh scratched his chin as he moved deeper into Sion's. He had grown a beard at the beginning of the years to help conceal his identity. He thought it was working so far. No one had accosted him. The beard was itchy, though. He wasn't willing to let it get long enough that the hair became soft and pliable. Untidiness bothered him. Trimming the beard with his dagger had proved impractical, and he was reluctant to magic, as shaping the beard with nothing more than a word and an imagined outcome was an uncertain prospect. Besides, he didn't trust a spell to remove the hairs but not his skin, and there was a craftsman-like satisfaction in attending to the task by hand. He bought a pair of iron clippers from tinkers outside Narada. They worked well enough as long as he kept them sharp-oiled and free of rust. Even so, he found maintaining the beard almost as much trouble as shaving. Maybe he would remove it after leaving Sion. The main streets was a muddy strip twice the width of a southern road. Buildings were half-timbered, cruck-framed structures with lap strake sliding between the wooden beams. The beams themselves were stained black with pine tar, which protected them against salt from the bay and may and many were decorated with carvings of sea serpents, birds, and svratlings. Iron weathered vanes sat idle atop every shingled, steep-sided roof, and a carved dragon's head decorated the peak of most houses. Murtagh forced himself to stop scratching. He could have recited the whole history of the city from his foundings until the present. He knew that the carvings were in the style of commonly called kisks, which had been invented by some anonymous craftsperson over a century past, that the black stone in the outer walls came from a quarry not 24 miles northeast, and that the good folks of Cian had deathly fear of the elves' force, de Wildevarden, and went to great lengths to keep the ranks of dark-needled pine trees from encroaching on their fields, and on all that and more he knew. But to what end? He received the finest education in the land, and then some, and yet his life was now one of a rough travel, where sharpness of hearing, quickness, one hand meant more than scholarly learning, besides understanding what was and what one should do were two very different things. He had seen that with Galabrix, the king had known more than most, more even than some of the oldest elves or dragons, but in the end his knowledge had brought with it no wisdom. Few people were on the streets. It was late, and the days following Maddentide were full of feasting, and most of the citizens were inside celebrating another successful harvest of Benjamin. A trio of laborers stragged past, stinking of cheap beer and fish guts. Murtagh held his course, and they divided across around him. Once they turned a corner, the main thoroughfare again fell silent, and he didn't see another person until he crossed the city's market square with a pair of feathered merchants bursts out of warehouse door, arguing vociferous. A short bearded figure followed them into the square. His voice bellowed loudest of all. A dwarf! Murtagh ducked his head. Ever since the death of Galabrix and the fall of the empire over a year ago, dwarves had become increasingly common throughout human-settled lands. Most were traders selling stones and metals and weapons, but he'd also seen dwarves working as armored guards. Short as they were, their prowess in battle was not to be underestimated. Murtagh couldn't help but wonder how many of them were acting as eyes and ears for the king, Oric, who sat upon the marble throne in the city mountain of Thorogem. The backlit dwarf seemed to look his way at Murtagh's reeled Slyton. Another Maddentide, drunk on his way home. The ruse worked, and the dwarf returned his attention to the squabbling merchant. Murtagh hurried on. The spread of the dwarves had made travel even more difficult for him, and Murtagh had nothing against the dwarves as a race or culture. Indeed, liked Oric, and their feats of architecture and astonishing. However, they held a deep and abiding hatred for him for killing King Halfrag, Oric's predecessor and uncle, and dwarves were known for tendencies with which they held their grudges could be ever made amends to Oric, his clan, and the dwarves as a whole. Were it possible, Murtagh had yet to think of that means. Unfortunately, his situation with the dwarves wasn't unique to the elves, maintained a similar anonymity towards him and Thorn, on account of the role they had played in killing Ornemus and Glader, the last surviving rider and dragon before Galbraith's rise to power. Murtagh could hardly blame them. The average human was no fonder of them. It was widely believed that they betrayed the Varden of Galbraith's during the war traitors. Earned only competent from both sides in a conflict. Rightly so, Murtagh himself had no sympathy for snake-tongued oath breakers like his father, but that did not make it easy to be falsely branded as one. No safe harbor for us, thought Murtagh. A hard, humorless smile formed on his lips. So it had been his whole life. Why should it be any different now? The stench of fish, seaweed, and salt grew stronger as he moved along the wharves and past rows of drying racks set beside the street. He glanced up. Midnight was still 3 or 4 hours away, plenty of time to conclude his business and depart Sian. After so long spent out of doors in the wild reaches of the land, the cluelessness of the building felt uncomfortable, constraining in that he was becoming more and more like Thorn. Music and voices sounded ahead of him, and he saw the common house that was his destination, the fulsome feast. The low, dark-beamed building had crystal windows set in the front-facing wall, a rare luxury in his part of the world, and petals of yellow light spread across the paving stones on the street, a welcome invitation to enter, rest, and make merry. Saros had picked the place as the location of their next meeting, and that alone made Murtagh wary. Still, the fulsome feast seemed inconsistent enough. Just one more disheveled, hard-run establishment, like so many others. Aside from the crystal windows, the common house could have been in any seaside town or village through the land, but then Murtagh had learned long ago that appearances were rarely to be trusted. He steeled himself against the noise to follow and pushed open the door.